Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event on Funding Democracy, Participatory Budgeting in Canada. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Today's presentation is part of a series that we call Big City, Big Ideas, or BCBI for short. This series, which we started a few years ago, is a speaker series that is co-sponsored by the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, the School of Public Policy and Governance here at U of T, the Innovation Policy Lab, the Martin Prosperity Institute, the Department of Geography and Planning, the Global Cities Institute, and Urban Strategies. Before we start the event, I'm supposed to tell you that we have two event hashtags this afternoon. Some of you will get that, some of you won't. Hashtag IMFG Talks and hashtag BCBI. And our Twitter handle is at IMFG Toronto. Now we'll go back to things I do understand. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Peter McLeod. Peter is the co-founder and principal of Mass LBP and is one of Canada's leading experts on public engagement and deliberative democracy. And I know that because I've worked with Peter on citizen reference panels in Toronto and Calgary and watched him take a bunch of diverse people and make some sense out of very complex topics, and he's very good at it. He has many achievements that are listed on his bio, and I really am not going to go through them all. I'll just mention a few. Peter is the director of Tides Canada and Gen Squeeze. He was appointed to serve on the Ontario government's Open Government Task Force, and in 2015 was elected co-chair of Toronto's Wellesley Institute for Urban Health. Peter was the 2008 recipient of the Public Policy Forum's Emerging Leaders Award, and most importantly, Peter is a graduate of the University of Toronto. So please welcome Peter McLeod, who will introduce our guest speaker and moderate this afternoon's session. Peter.
It's a very kind introduction. Some of it happens to be true. It is really nice to be back at the University of Toronto, and of course it's a return for our guest speaker today, Josh Lerner, who completed his master's degree here. So it's homecoming of sorts. And you know, I guess, obviously, with a topic like this afternoon, you really have to call in a professional facilitator when you're dealing with such unruly, uncivil people. We're going to try and, play fair, but we're going to talk about some really important issues. And I have to confess off the top that I am a really big admirer of Josh Lerner's work. I'm also a great fan of Shelley Carroll and Alex Mazur. Shelley, of course, is the city's longtime representative of Don Valley East. She's a former deputy mayor and a current voice for us on the TTC board. She is in every way a highly capable councillor who knows the city better than most and has championed participatory budgeting in Toronto. Alex also deserves our applause and appreciation for his efforts to make Toronto's municipal budget something that the rest of us might one day hope to understand. And now he's doing the same for our pension system. So he's the rare kind of guy who's making the numbers that matter to people really matter in the best possible way to see that those numbers serve the public good. Our plan this afternoon is really quite simple. Josh is going to speak for 20 or so minutes, then Shelley and Alex are going to respond, then the four of us are going to mix it up for a little bit longer, and we're going to open the floor to you. But before introducing Josh, I want to just make a few short observations. I think it's quite fitting that the Institute is hosting this afternoon's session because I'm starting to feel a very kind of un-Canadian bullishness about the pace and range of democratic activities in Toronto. I actually think you can make a strong case for there being some kind of Toronto school of democratic innovation, or maybe in language more familiar to planners, a kind of democracy cluster is taking shape here. And when you think about it, over the last decade, There have been a series of great organizations that have made their home here in Toronto. It's folks like Cliff Vanderlinden and Vox Pop Labs, who've probably filled out his vote compass during a municipal, provincial, or federal election. We've got Sarah Schulman with In With Forward, changing the way that public services are designed and offered. We've got Scott Baker at Adjacent Possibilities, Jane Hilderman at Samara, Taylor Gunn at Civics. We've got Zara over at Architects, and Tanya at the CSI, and Yuri at the Solutions Lab, and it's a long list. It's a healthy list. We've got programs like Studio Y, we've got the Institute Without Boundaries, we've got participatory design firms like Public Work, and we've got marketing, social marketing companies like the long and now venerable Manifest and newer shops like Public, and they're here in the city. So I think it's fitting that the Institute, in a way, recognizes that work by bringing a true leader in a larger movement, not only with connections to Toronto, but around the world. I guess if I have to characterize this cluster, though, there are a few things that make it distinctive and perhaps very Toronto. Probably its emphasis on both learning and inclusiveness, as we each in our different ways work to bridge the distance between citizens and the state. I think there's a common ethos that doesn't see government as fundamentally broken, but as needing more of a helping hand. And that regardless of the activities of our political parties, democracy isn't understood as a kind of winner-take-all majoritarian game, but as something more subtle, as a way to work together through disagreement, and as a reason to keep talking. So projects here in Toronto tend to scaffold. They support existing institutions. They aren't populist attempts to overrule or overrun our democratic infrastructure. And I think that's fundamentally healthy. I also think that participatory budgeting aligns well with this sensibility. Yes, it's about getting more people engaged and hearing about what they think and want, but it's also about learning from one another, learning more about the constraints and also the abilities of government and grappling with the trade-offs and the very hard work of governing. So Josh, I think, deserves big kudos, though, because while we're saturated with pilots and proposals to do cool things, he's actually one of the guys who's managed to take one of these cool things to scale. It's an important idea. It's one that he's pursued diligently for over 15 years. And in the best of circumstances, being an entrepreneur is a tough gig. Being a democracy entrepreneur is something altogether different. He has been pioneering a compelling approach that is so useful and complementary to the work of government. It's something different, it's something rare, it's something I think that deserves our attention. You'll hear that he's been working across North America and Latin America and in Europe. His work has been recognized by, you might have heard of it, the White House, as a model for open government. And he's also the recipient of the Brown Democracy Medal as, I love this title, the best practical innovation advancing democracy around the world. He completed his PhD in politics at the New School for Social Research in New York City, where he's currently a resident. And as you've heard, he might have even taken a class with Enid when he was doing his master's in planning from the University of Toronto. If you are intrigued and tantalized by what he has to say, this afternoon, you can read more of it from his two books. Another great title, Making Democracy Fun, How Game Design Can Empower Citizens and Transform Politics, from no less than the MIT Press, as well as Everybody Counts, Could Participatory Budgeting Change Democracy, from Cornell. Let's give a warm, rousing welcome back to Toronto to Josh Lerner.
Thank you so much, Peter. So I think it's been around a dozen years since I've been at the Monk School. The last time I was here, I was getting a master's. Probably had just taken Enid's public finance course, which I reminded her of today. And I was searching for ideas for how to make democracy work. And in particular, for how to make it meaningful. So the people who are very cynical about democracy would think that it matters and show up. for how to make democracy inclusive so the people who are normally on the sidelines would be able to participate and would participate actively. And how to make democracy more equitable so that our democratic decisions channel resources to our greatest needs. And another professor at U of T, actually at OISE right nearby, recommended that I look at participatory budgeting. And I'll be honest, my first thought was that it sounded awfully boring. I was not a public finance nerd, no offense to those in the crowd today. And this did not seem to me like the hook to reinvent democracy, that talking about budgets and numbers. And it wasn't until I started talking with some of the tenants at Toronto Community Housing who have been doing PB for around 14 years now, actually, and seeing how they got extremely excited by deciding how to spend money in their buildings, on improving their buildings and their grounds. And then when I went to Latin America and spent a year there talking with folks in Brazil and Argentina and elsewhere, low-income people in favelas and shanty towns who saw this as their entryway into government, as the way to actually make democracy real. Seeing people who are the most affected by and marginalized by a lot of government policies see this as a way to make government work for them is what drew me in. And as Peter said, I've been working on this for over a dozen years now, and have seen across, at this point, around 17 cities across the US and Canada, how it can work, and also some of the challenges and opportunities of trying to democratize public spending and democratize budgets. So I'd like to share a bit of that with you tonight. I'll also show a short video so you can see how this works in practice. And I hope that this discussion does lead to some big new ideas, which is a fantastic frame for events like this. So a bit of background on me, and I'll add one more, not a hashtag, but a Twitter handle for those of you who use Twitter. Josh A. Lerner, and also at PB Project is our organizational Twitter handle. Glad to join the discussion there, not while I'm up here talking, of course. And so I direct an organization called the Participatory Budgeting Project. We're a nonprofit organization based in the US. I'm based in New York. And after doing this work for several years, including here in Toronto, founded the organization in 2009 when we launched the first process in Chicago. We're incorporated as a nonprofit in 2011. And our mission is to empower people to decide together how to spend public money in a wide range of contexts, whether it's city governments, schools, agencies, organizations, provinces, states, federal government. We're getting there as well. We work across the US and Canada and have offices in New York, Oakland, and staff in Chicago and Greensboro. And the work has really been taking off over the past couple of years, as Peter alluded to, and I'll talk a bit more about tonight. I'd like to start actually talking about problems, though. So what are the problems that brought me to this work, and what are the problems that I hope this can help solve? And to be really upfront about the problems in our democracy, we often talk about democratic renewal and how great it is folks are engaging. For most people on the ground, democracy is not working too well. And as we've seen in the States, there's an incredible frustration with the establishment and with government, and that's leading to both Donald Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left, people who have no other outlets within the system to work and are looking to tear it down or work outside of it. And for me, a lot of that frustration is really valid, and it comes down to people's experiences with our democracy. And so one of the main problems for a lot of folks is that participation in democracy is painful. So this is what people think of public meetings, for the most part. People coming out, yelling at government, protesting against things that have been decided that they don't support. For city staff, this is what you can expect from a public meeting. You can expect to get chewed out, to have your policies be torn apart. And no one really wants to come to this, even this guy probably. So people in the community don't want to hear people yelling. People, city staff and officials don't want to get chewed out by the public. And so a lot of folks stay home, understandably so. Another big problem is that participation is unequal. The people who participate do not reflect demographics of people in the community. This is actually from a consultation in New York, Plan NYC, that Mayor Bloomberg put on. And I recently learned, I thought these two were brothers. I learned they're not brothers, actually. They're actually planners in New York, so I've stopped disparaging them in my presentations. I'm sure they're very nice guys. But I would hope this is not the target audience for public engagement. And too often it is. That people who participate are disproportionately white, more affluent, older, and that everyone else's views gets left on the sidelines. And then a huge problem for people is that participation is usually powerless. This is an old French student poster. It says, I participate, you participate, he participates, we participate, you all participate, they decide. And people aren't stupid. They recognize that most decisions are made behind closed doors before meetings, and that they often have limited power if they come out to participate. And so they usually don't. So for me, people's disengagement from democracy makes a lot of sense based on the democracy we are offering to them. And one thing I talk about in my book, which I have some copies of here, is how we can redesign democracy to actually be a meaningful experience, something that people see as something that matters, that has outcomes, that they actually get a positive experience from rather than it being a civic chore. So what we try and do with participatory budgeting is to change participation and redesign it to be more empowering and to focus on the participant. So taking what is normally a very expert-centered process, come out to an event, hear the experts, maybe you can respond to them, react to them, but it's all about the technical experts, it's all about city staff and officials, and refocus participation on participants, on people in the community. Why should they come out? What would they get out of it? How can they participate? How can they feel that it's worth their time to come out? So these are two pictures, actually both of participatory budgeting events. One on the left, very expert-centered. There's a city staff person up front presenting, rows of people sitting there listening to him, maybe seeing him, maybe not. The one on the right is from what we call a project expo, where some of the residents are presenting the projects they developed for the ballot and talking with their neighbors. And you can look at these and think, which event would you rather be at? Would you rather be sitting behind 6 rows of people behind a pole, listening to an expert talk for an hour, or would you rather be talking with a neighbor, having something to drink, some food, looking at pictures, learning about a project that is in your community that's tangible, looking at photos? And we see that folks on the right come back, and folks on the left often leave very frustrated and don't come back. So that's one of the bigger picture lessons I hope that you can take from this event is how can we redesign participation and democracy to be focused more on the people we want to participate and less on us, which is a hard thing to do because we are us. And so we think about our needs first. I want to pivot a bit and talk about participatory budgeting in the context of other kinds of engagement in budgeting. So how does this differ from other ways that cities and governments are engaging folks in budgeting? And kind of adapt a ladder based on Sherry Arnstein's letters of participation from 4 or 5 decades ago at this point. And the most common ways that cities and governments are engaging people in budgeting, hearings and deputations, I'm sure you're familiar with, the kind of 3 minutes at the mic model. Come up here, share your view for 3 minutes, sit down. At best, it's a form of listening. More often, it's a form of tokenism, where it's a show put on because it's required by law, and that things have already been decided beforehand. Testimonies have little impact. A lot of cities are using online games now, which I'm obviously a big fan of games. And I think some of these games are fantastic at helping people to understand how budgets work and play around with dynamic systems. So if you increase this program area or this project, how does that affect the budgets? How can you have trade-offs between different expenditures? So they're fantastic at that. Usually they haven't been connected with actual budget decision making. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's been the experience so far. Other cities use focus groups or town hall meetings, bringing people together at small tables to talk about the budget and what their priorities are as a form of consultation. So getting a sense of what people think and using that then as input to pass on to the government. Other cities use boards or councils and give them some actual power over a certain part of the budget, whether it's community grants or planning funds. So folks who are on that board or council can decide directly how to spend some of those resources. If you're not on the board or council, then you don't really have a space at the table. So the main difference between those and participatory budgeting is that in participatory budgeting, and I'll switch to saying PB too, I think other folks will start saying that too. It's not talking about peanut butter, but participatory budgeting. Anyone can participate. So there's full participation from the community. It's open to anyone. And the typical definition, democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend part of a public budget. That sounds pretty straightforward. I find that the devil's in the details, and it's often hard to get a sense of what that really means. So I want to take a brief interlude actually and show a short video that will give you a sense of how this works on the ground in cities across North America.
Right, if you live in this community and you pay taxes, come out and vote, decide how your tax dollars get spent.
Participatory budgeting gives people real power over real money to make the decisions that affect their lives. It's a democratic process in which ordinary community members directly decide how to spend part of the public budget.
Oh, this is different because you're actually voting for where the money is going to be spent instead of allowing them to decide where to spend the money.
Who knows better about their community than the people that live in their community?
Not be afraid of the big words, participatory budgeting. It sounds boring, but it's the opposite of that.
So how does it work? First, people brainstorm ideas. They come together in meetings and assemblies and start to think of what kinds of projects they would like to see in their neighborhood.
We had to think big. We have $1 million that we could use, so we can fund parks, health issues, streets.
Volunteers work with experts to turn people's initial ideas into full project proposals.
We started with maybe about 40 projects, and so we had a series of budget delegate meetings, and we narrowed down the list into about 4 or 5 projects.
We met with the Parks Department and we talked about what we wanted to see change in some of the parks and how we were going to work with them.
What are the real needs of the community? If you only have a certain amount of money, what is it that you can do that's going to benefit as many people as possible?
I'm dreaming of new benches, modern benches. Seniors have nowhere to go.
Displays at bus shelters throughout the district, and it will tell people when the next bus is due to arrive.
We're asking for a projector and 30 Mac laptops.
State-of-the-art teen fitness center.
To put solar panels on a firehouse.
After volunteers share the top projects, the community gets ready to vote.
It's a way of validating every voice in our community and saying, you know what, whatever your position is, you live in our community, you have a right to decide. And that me as a representative and government should respond and should listen to that voice. Anybody could vote in this process, immigrants, whether you're documented or not, young people that normally don't get to vote.
Most people, they don't even know that CEOs can come out here and vote today. Some of them are really surprised. They said, really? I said, yeah. They have a voice.
The projects with the most votes get funded.
The Red Hook Library Community Garden, right here.
The projects are then implemented over the next few years. And the following year, the process starts again. People brainstorm new ideas, turn them into new projects, vote on them, and fund more improvements for their community. PB becomes part of the budget process. It becomes a new way of governing.
I think this is like the greatest wave of democracy coming into the United States. It started in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989.
From there, it spread all over Latin America to over 1,500 cities around the world. In Toronto, public housing tenants have decided how to spend millions of dollars on improvements to their buildings. City council members in Chicago, New York, and other cities have engaged thousands of residents in allocating discretionary funds. Entire cities have launched PB, such as in Vallejo, California, for funds from a sales tax, and in Boston for youth funds. Even schools and universities have used PB.
This was a great opportunity for you to be a part of government and better the city you live in. Who wouldn't want to take advantage of that?
You're creating a more educated platform of voters overall. So I think this can only be good for the big project of democracy.
Cool, not bad, huh? I will say we're looking for a new narrator if anyone wants to volunteer their voice to the next version of the project. It's been me for the past 2 iterations looking for a new voice there. So nice thing about when the video works is then you can skip through a bunch of other stuff. It shows it very well. And so I think you saw a good sense of how the process works in the video there. And I think the core of it is very simple. People brainstorm ideas, turning them into projects. There's a vote. The mechanics of that are very complicated when you bring together ordinary citizens and city staff to figure out how to govern together. And to me, that's a joy to figure that out with people. At this point, there's over 3,000 processes around the world. And one thing I want to stress is this has been used at all kinds of levels. So from district to city to state to schools, school districts, universities, agencies, any kind of institution that has some kind of public serving budget has tried this somewhere around the world. And there's tons of experimentation happening, including here in Toronto. In North America, there's been a huge growth over the past decades. The first couple processes started out in Toronto and in Ontario, so Toronto Community Housing, as the video mentioned, in around 2001, and the city of Guelph as well. Toronto Community Housing is still running its process. And since then, there have been several other cities in the US and increasingly in Canada as well. So Peterborough just launched a process this year. Montreal is set to launch another one actually coming up in the fall. So it's been growing quite quickly. We'll talk more, I think, in the discussion, some of the other presenters about the experiences in Toronto and how that's going. Mainly, I want to lift up some of the bigger experiences to point to these bigger ideas, how we can take this to the next level here in Toronto and elsewhere. If you like dots, you can look at some dots here that show the growth of PB in dot format. So you can see, this is in the US and Canada, some of the growth over the past several years in particular. It's really been exploding, and I think there's many more. At this point, I think there were 67 processes in at last count. So it's grown quite a bit. Probably the biggest one at this point is in New York City. So we just wrapped up the vote in New York. You saw a lot of footage from the video of that. Started out with 4 council members in 2011, and it's now 28, so over half the city. And this year, 67,000 people participated in deciding how to spend $35 million, which is great. It's still a starting point. We hope to grow that. But I think it shows that when you put real money on the table, people will show up. And there have been hundreds of projects that have been done at the community level through this process. The majority of participants have been people of color, low income, some of the folks who have been most marginalized from traditional city government elections. And it's also been a great model, I think, for how to do this with the community. That's one thing I really want to stress here, that the experiences we've seen in the US and some of the successful ones in Canada haven't just been government projects. They've been governments working together with community groups to govern together. And the first step usually being setting up a steering committee of community groups to actually write the rules for the process and say, this is how we want to participate, and to design the process with government. And what we see is that when you get community groups invested in the process, they put in a lot of time and effort to make it work. They help bring out their members and their communities. They make sure that all parts of the city are represented, and they help grow the process. So since that model in New York, which I think has really been an inspiration for a lot of folks, we launched the first citywide process in Vallejo, California, which also shows that this can work pretty much anywhere. Vallejo, California was the largest city in the US to go bankrupt at the time. So it didn't exactly have a lot of extra resources around, which is often one response we get. How can we possibly free up budget funds? And the question isn't so much how do you carve out money from the budget, it's how do you decide the money that's already there? Each year, decisions are made about a budget regardless, and this really opens up the discussion about who can participate in that decision-making to a broader public. So in Vallejo, it's now entering its 4th year, the first citywide process. A lot of places have been using youth participatory budgeting, so engaging young people in the process and really focusing it on young people. In Boston, the Mayor Menino and now Mayor Marty Walsh launched a youth process from the mayor's office, where each year young people are deciding how to spend $1 million. And young people wrote the rules for the process, they come up with the projects, they vote. If you go to vote and you're over 25, you get carded and turned away. So it's actually only for people under 25 to vote, which is an incredibly empowering experience for them. And we're actually having a conference in a couple of weeks in Boston to coincide with the vote for the 3rd cycle of youth participatory budgeting there. And this year they're trying a new thing too, which we can talk about more perhaps, of integrating this with broader policy making. So in this year's ballot, they'll have projects for the $1 million, and also they'll have policy priorities for the city overall. And so giving youth a chance to weigh in on overall city policy priorities. We've seen lots of schools take up participatory budgeting as well. This is actually a community college in San Antonio in Texas that's been doing PB, first with students and first with faculty and now with students as well. We've seen several schools, including here in Toronto, Kipling High did a PB process with its students. and school boards and school districts increasingly interested as well. So for schools, it's often as much about learning democracy as it is about the money itself. The money is a kind of hook to get students active, engaged, and learning democratic skills. And part of this growth has been that the PB is being used to support broader democracy efforts. So as Peter said, this is a tool that fits in, I think, within a broader realm of democratic renewal and growth and innovation. And we've seen a lot of movements and institutions look to PB as a way to use a tried and true process to engage people at a large scale. So we've been working with the White House, both to plug open data into participatory budgeting and to allocate federal funds through PB. And there'll be some opportunities here as well to allocate provincial or federal funds through PB at the local level. Resilient Cities has been taking this up as a way to make cities more resilient by having people come together and decide on policy. And Black Lives Matter as a way to recenter budgets around people who have too often been marginalized from politics. So there's a lot of broader efforts this is plugging into, and that's, I think, been one of the keys to its growth. And I just want to wrap up by talking about some of the impacts and why people are doing this. You could probably sense from the video, this is a lot of work. And those of you, Shelley can attest to this, that it's a lot easier to have a couple staff deciding how to spend a budget than to engage hundreds and thousands of people over several months. So why bother? And that's a valid critique, and one we get a lot is this is a lot of work. What we've seen is that if governments invest in the process, that the payoffs more than match that investment, but it does require that initial investment. And so when cities have put in the resources, put in the staff time, put money on the table, that they get much broader participation. People who normally don't show up, that normally don't engage, participate in the process. So in Vallejo, for example, 20% of voters were ineligible to participate in typical elections, whether because they were younger than typical voting age, or they're not documented, or not citizens, or in the US, ex-offenders are often disenfranchised, but they can vote in PB. So people who normally wouldn't be able to participate have been. In New York City, we've seen that a higher percentage of low-income residents voted in PB than typical local elections. So in many respects, it's actually more democratic, more representative than typical local elections as far as who you're hearing from. Another big selling point or impact from the perspective of officials and staff is stronger relationships between governments, organizations, and residents. So less based on protest and more based on collaboration. That's when people participate, they tend to have a better view of government. Their trust in government increases. Or actually, to revise that, their trust in government stays the same. Their trust in the government that does PB increases. They're still very cynical about government overall. But they will trust the official who engages them meaningfully, which is an important distinction to make. People aren't stupid. PB often functions as a kind of leadership development program, or a school of democracy, folks have called it. So each year, new people come in, they learn new civic skills, so public speaking, researching, talking with officials, and then they use those skills to get more done in their community. So a lot of organizations are using this to develop their membership, to develop their base, teach them new skills so they can be more effective. And then finally, it's led to more equitable and effective spending. It's actually a better way to decide how money is spent, that when you bring people in, that money has been more likely to go to low-income neighborhoods. People have identified ways to address needs at lower cost, to find more creative ways to get projects done, or to bring in matching funds from other sources to supplement the resources on the table. And I want to kind of close talking a bit about equity and inclusion, which is often the biggest question that we get, and one of the elephants in the room of how do you bring people who don't come to events like this into city government. And this is not easy by any means, but for me, it's really at the heart of what we need to do to fix democracy. That if we don't refocus democracy on people who are not participating, that we're just privileging the privileged. So our approach to making sure that equity and inclusion is at the forefront of this process, starting out with money that matters for the people that you want to engage. So what do low-income communities, what do immigrants, what do youth care about? Put that money on the table. Have them actually lead the process. So we typically make sure those groups become leaders of the steering committee, that they are playing a lead role so that when people in the community look at this process, they see faces that look like them. They see people they know, that they have relationships with. Designing the process to be inclusive, and this is one thing where you can do with PB in different ways than typical democratic processes. You can take the vote to the people. You don't have to bring people out to polling sites. You can actually bring polling sites to supermarkets. We have voting at a McDonald's, at church after services, at schools during the school day. You'll get a lot of youth voting then. So you can actually design it to be more inclusive. There with all of that, doing targeted outreach. So we will hire canvassers to go into Bangladeshi immigrant communities, speak Bangla with people, and get them involved in the process, building on their relationships. And as a result, they show up. And then finally, integrating using equity criteria so that projects can actually get higher scores if they benefit lower income communities. So embedding that into the funding process. So I think I'll wrap up there, and just a couple next steps that I hope we can talk about more in the discussion, and I hope you can take. And first of all, if folks are interested in learning more, I have a couple copies of my book here. I'm glad to share that later. There's a sign-in sheet outside to join our mailing list and get updates. And there's been a lot of energy around PB in Toronto for over a decade, and since when I actually did my master's thesis on PB in Toronto, and could it possibly work? And it has been working, and it's great to see a pilot at the city level as well. And I think the time is really ripe, as Peter said, to try something big and bold. And we've seen that when you have real money on the table and you have millions of dollars, people will show up and they will get engaged. And this inspires tons of civic action and really gets thousands of people who normally would not participate to be leading democracy renewal and to be reinventing ways to engage. So I'm most interested in talking about how we can take this to the next level in Toronto and across Canada. Taking advantage of the openings that you all have here with new provincial governments and federal governments and some new energy at the municipal level, and to see what we can get done together. So thank you very much.
The slides you'll be looking at while I speak are about the process that took place in my ward just last year. It's actually going on in 3 different wards in the city right now through a pilot project that's actually being conducted right out of our Office of Engagement in the City Manager's office. Meg Shields is here, who's leading that pilot. Meg, wave. And sitting, so my teacher is here and the principal's here too. Josie Levita, who is our senior financial planner, is here. And these are all people who've actually sat in a room and gained their enthusiasm for making this work from having Josh on one of his visits to Toronto actually speak to city staff. Prior to that, it was going on in TCHC. So how did I become the person who was the biggest nag about getting it more embedded in our budget process? Well, in the last year of my 4 years as the chair of the budget committee, I used to give a presentation every year to Social Planning to Toronto on what was the launch, and in the final one in that term of office, so that would have been in the month of January in 2006, I was giving my usual presentation of the budget to Social Planning Toronto, lots of folks in the room there. And that day, the event was being moderated by Judy Rebick. And when I finished giving my little presentation, she said, before I open it up to questions from the audience, she pretty much tore my face off because there was a very progressive mayor at the time. I was supposed to be progressive, and yet how was I not doing participatory budgeting? And I hemmed and hawed my way through answering it, first of all, because Judy's pretty scary, as you all know, but also because really at that point, other than the fact that there was this little discussion and this growing use of it for the tenant representatives in TCHC, we just had this urban myth that we couldn't do it in Toronto because we were cash strapped, we were still struggling with post-amalgamation blues, and we would have to herd everyone into a football field like we were told they had done in Porto Alegre, and all 2 million people would have to make a decision right now. And I couldn't envision us doing that with what little cash we had. So I just sort of hemmed and hawed my way through it, but I did promise to get to know about it. And that's what led me to actually beginning to read about where is it going on, How is it going on in TCHC? And then one day I got a phone call from a very angry tenant rep in one of the complexes that's right in my own ward, because they'd done their PB dutifully, and the project they had chosen had gone to the TCHC board with the project had gone with the global budget for TCHC, and the board had changed it. It had amended what they had voted on. So it ceased to be, she informed me, it ceased to be participatory budgeting at that moment. What are you going to do about that? So then I realized I really need to know. Luckily, Josh was just about to have his first conference as they were launching the process in Brooklyn. So the model that we're using in the City of Toronto now for the pilot is actually based on the model being used in New York City and Brooklyn, and Joe Moore, Alderman Joe Moore in Chicago's model that he's using in Ward 49 there, and has been. I think he's on his 5th year. It would be his 5th year now. 7th, yeah, he is the granddaddy. Joe Moore, Alderman Joe Moore, Ward 49, the granddaddy of them all. And right out of the gate, people said, you can't do this because you don't have what they have in those big cities, in the strong mayor model cities. You don't get $1 million in menu money, they call it every year. There, the mayor only sees his council once a year. He gives them $1 million and tells them to go away. And very unaccountably, they would do poll analysis, look for where they needed to shore up some votes and fix some roads there with their $1 million. Joe decided he should maybe ask the residents how to do it, and went on the same journey I did. What is this participatory budgeting? And so I wanted to do that, but I don't get $1 million in menu money. And started to talk about it, and we were still very cash strapped. And then I found out, wait a minute, cities are always broke and always will be. There must be a way to free up some money. To demonstrate it, I broke Joe's rule. He said, if you're going to do this, you do the process that Josh has showed us, but you will notice that the last of the points in Josh's video that you can all get on his website, you're all going to end up downloading it, the last thing is implement. And you've got to be able to deliver those within a year. I wanted to demonstrate to the city that we should be doing PB, so I did it with a thing that's unique to our community. And if any of you who live in a downtown community know what Section 37 money is, you argue about the development. The community benefit money comes the day they pick up their building permit. So I actually did a participatory budgeting process. We spent $500,000 of that money, but you don't really control when the money arrives. So you can't control when it gets implemented. That's the struggle. And that is the point at which I got really, really angry and said, we have to do this the right way. We do actually have to use tax money. So my lovely parting gift from City Manager Joe Penichetti before he left the city was to say, yeah, you're right, we probably should. We put a motion through, and so what is happening in the city now in a pilot that the city has now generously allowed us to do for 3 years is we are actually using tax money, and we are actually experiencing every part of the model. In my ward in Don Valley East, but also in the ward of Councillor Frank DiGiorgio, sort of on the west end of North York, and Councillor Michelle Holland, who is in a sort of Scarborough waterfront ward. Vastly different regions. None of them is right downtown, but we actually applaud, the 3 councillors applaud the fact that the city manager's office said we have to do this pilot not in the easiest place to do it. We actually have to provide the acid test. We're going to have to actually gather data on this and actually find out if we can make it work. I guess I'm the control group because I'd actually had a practice run at it the year before, and I'm an ardent fan of it. The other 2 councillors not so sure about it, and so we're getting a really good look at how it works. Does it build capacity as Josh promises, and does it cumulatively build to the participation we want? We're right now looking at participation of maybe 300 people vote, maybe 500 people vote. We want to get to where, what's Carlos's last name? Councillor Carlos, Josh, what's his last name? Machaca, who this year had 6,300 constituents cast votes in his PB process. How does that sound, Meg? I'm going to get you a voter turnout of 6,300 constituents, or die trying. That was to spend $1 million. This year we'll be spending $250,000. And I can tell you that parts of what Josh has described really do happen. What we have in Toronto is a dynamic throughout not just the budget process, but throughout our entire municipal dialogue of, we have an idea how to get out of a mess or how to make something better, a bike lane. We propose something and you say no. And if the no gets really loud, we don't do it. If the no is just a little bit, we call it a pilot and we try it. And we fight back and forth. When we do have our formal budget process, we have a big deputation day, and people come and shout, and the group that sent the most people get something. And generally, we're fighting over a teeny tiny part of the budget. There's always more money for student nutrition because you can always load up a bus full of kids and bring them down and say, we need more, we need more. But there's nothing in there that actually gives them, instead of just begging for the money, we don't actually build their capacity to say, does this model work? We know we need to feed kids. Why is the money only the money that is? And why do you give it out the way you give it out? And do we need to change that? That conversation never happens between us and the user. There's only the conversation of, no, it's not enough, we need more. Or, no, why do we feed kids? It's not our job. Let's both yell and see who wins. That's our dialogue. In participatory budgeting, if you got in a room and you were just in a ward and someone came forward and said, I would actually not like to propose a single other community garden. I think we should just give money every year to student nutrition. Then what happens right before your eyes is not no, is the staff member says, well, that actually doesn't work for this. This is money that comes once a year. What you need is money that will come every year. You don't want us to start a breakfast program in a school and take it away next year. So we actually need an ongoing way of funding that. That's why we can't put it on the ballot. Should we park it over here on this board and you as a community talk about how we can solve that problem? Staff just learned that I'm not making it up as a counselor, that this community actually wants that to happen. They had to explain it in not a no moment, but a moment that it just came up because we were brainstorming ideas, and it is very visibly parked there now. And they do end up back at that conversation. And I know in my heart of hearts that when they get back to the ranch, when they go back to the office, next year's budget process comes around, they go, actually, you know, that's a real groundswell of people asking questions about that program. I heard it in Ward 33, and my other guy that I sent over to Michelle Holland's ward heard it there. It keeps coming up in PB, and we can't spend it there, but it's obviously something we've got to do. That happened. The other thing that's happening right now, Catherine and I, Catherine from my office in the back, we're going to do a meeting next week with a winning project last year. We're building a capacity of staff members to know how to talk about the project that actually has been said yes to. How do we now go ahead and implement it? Josh showed us a picture of a parks guy standing in a park with some PB voters. We're going to sit down next week because the gateway project to Bryan Drive won. But then you go to implement, and we can't put the planter there. We have to move it 9 meters because they always rip us off because they never do what we said we should do, blah, 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 blah. That dialogue is what usually happens because we usually just go and put it where we want to put it, and then they call the counselor and complain. Under PB, they voted on it. They're the champions of this project. So guess what, staff? They're coming back. The champion's going to come in and sit down with you, and you're going to explain why it can't go here, it has to go here, but what if we do this? We will spend all your money by enhancing it thusly. And the reason that it has to be that way, these are the legislative constraints. This is how we buy it. This is how the purchasing works. This is why it costs 80 grand and not 40 grand. And this is what that money gets you if we do it versus this worker or that bidding contract. The way the city works begins to unfold, not in a no moment, but in a getting to yes moment. A very rare thing in the city of Toronto, I would venture to say, from amalgamation to now. And in some of the legacy cities, since ever. We have some legacy cities within our new city of Toronto that have been no moments from the get-go. So this is a really new concept. It always happens about 2/3 of the way through the first time you do the process, when someone says, okay, we're deciding what goes on the ballot. I don't want a dog park. The answer isn't, so we're not putting that on the ballot. The answer is, so I guess you're going to go out into the community and campaign for one of the other projects. Because there isn't a no. There's only a choice as to which one you say yes to. You don't kill something, you pick something. That rarely happens in the city of Toronto. So I leave you with an assignment, because I look around here. I see some people from my ward. I see a lot of people who work downtown. I see a lot of people who live downtown. This is only happening in the suburbs. Other than TCHC, this is only happening in suburban wards. Downtown wards who could do it right now, they all think they're already doing it. Are they doing it? Have you done that in your ward? Have you really done that? No, it's very unique. You can be very consultative, but really changing it from yes or no to picking something out of a cluster of ideas that we all came up with, and we all cheer for whatever is the winning idea because we all win, something new happens in our ward. It's very rare, and I would submit that it's even rare downtown where we think we are the most consultative. It's changing it from is it yes or no to let's decide. The pilot has had 1 year of execution. We're going into our second. If you know anyone, if you are interning anyone, if you are mentoring anyone, and you don't tell them to call Meg Shields and say, how can I help you? How can I be a facilitator? How can I attend and build in this process? How can I give you more human resources in one of those 3 places? Because you saw how much work it takes. Then they're missing an opportunity to get involved in something that probably is the wave of the future of positive dialogue in the City of Toronto. Thanks.
So I also did a master's degree at University of Toronto, like Josh, and I studied political theory. And one of the concepts that I studied was the difference between a thin definition of democracy, where it's basically just like voting and the rule of law, and a thick concept of democracy. And I'm quite humbled to be a part of this panel because sitting alongside 3 people who have really been champions for a thick model of democracy, which I think PB is a big part of. So I want to cover a couple of points. I'll give you a quick sense of where I'm coming from and kind of how I got interested in this sort of public finance nerd thing. I want to try to set PB in a slightly broader context around the democratization of public finance. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about an evaluation that a group I'm a part of, Better Budget TO, did of the City of Toronto budget process for 2015, and then finally close with some thoughts on strengths and opportunities of improvement for the PB pilot that was done over the last year. Like Josh, I kind of fell into this topic by accident. I worked 4 years at the province on provincial budgets during the financial crisis. So kind of worked on issues of tax reform, austerity, stimulus, pensions, lots of things that will scare people off at cocktail parties. But learned through that very, very few people actually understand these decisions that lead to really multi-billion-dollar resource allocation decisions that really affect our society. And sometimes decisions are made with inadequate information, and often decision makers wish they had better information when they make those decisions. Was part of a group that started Better Budget TO about 3.5 years ago, which is really focused on trying to improve the City of Toronto budget process, and was started around the time when many of you remember the politics of City Council was quite different, and the budget was a focal point for some of that politics. I was a municipal candidate in the 2014 election and campaigned on PB, and actually found it was quite popular and resonated with people from across the political spectrum. And have since gone on to work in the field of pensions, which I think is related, as Peter mentioned. So in terms of setting PB in context, I think it's very important that we think about it as part of a broader set of solutions around democratizing public finance and improving the effectiveness of government. Sometimes critics of PB will say, well, it's so small. does it really make a very big difference? Or it's a trinket, or it'll be an excuse and you expect it to be a solution to all your problems. And I don't think the true people who are championing PB are saying that at all. They're saying it can be a useful and a very powerful tool at a time that we need those tools. And so I really think about budgeting as a really underappreciated part of democracy. If you think about public spending, in Canada we allocate something like 42% of our economy through some sort of public budgeting processes. That's how much we spend on public services and government spending overall, and yet it's something that very few people understand. If you think about the way that civics is taught, for example, there's a huge focus on the legislative process, but there's very little focus on budgeting. And even elected people themselves often don't think of themselves as people who help allocate money. They think of themselves sometimes as people who pass laws. Even the term legislature suggests that. But yet there's a very fundamental responsibility as stewards of the public purse that elected people have, and often they wish they had better information. So, what are some of the benefits? Better civic engagement, I think, is a really big part of it. Obviously, something that we need. Better decisions. Josh talked about that as well. I think a fairer allocation of resources, the more people we get involved. I also think there's a very important economic argument. If you think about a more transparent, inclusive process for allocating that 42% of GDP, it's likely to lead to a more efficient resource allocation in the same way that people make arguments about markets, in theory, at least being effective allocations of resources for the other portion of the economy. And then also the issue of less corruption and more accountability in public spending is a very important point and has been made more often in the developing world than in cities like ours. It's also part of a global movement, right? It's not just in Toronto. And so you've seen organizations like the World Bank, which now has an open budget portal. There are NGOs around the world. I'll just name a couple of them. There's International Budget Partnership, the Open Knowledge Foundation, and the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency that do really good work on this topic, in addition to some of the initiatives that Josh mentioned. And so a lot of leadership, and PB is a great example, having come out of Brazil, the leadership on this has come from emerging economies, and the innovation has come from emerging economies. And I think there's a lot more sometimes that we can learn from those places than they can learn from us. So if you take it back to the city of Toronto, and I really want to thank IMFG for highlighting this topic. I think there's a couple of really important things that IMFG has done over the years. One is being a source of independent expert input on the city of Toronto's budget at a time when we often need that perspective, but also bringing ideas from around the world and having a real international perspective. And I think highlighting this and bringing Josh to speak as part of it is a great example of that. So I'm very grateful for that. So in 2015, our group conducted basically a volunteer-run review of the City of Toronto's budget process, and I've got a couple copies here for those who are interested. And we looked at it basically from the point of view of 4 principles. One being participation, the second being accessibility, the third being vision, and the fourth being evidence-based. Are we making decisions on the basis of evidence? And the basic conclusion was that the city had actually made a lot of progress over the last 3 or 4 years since some of the darker days of the 2011-2012 budgets. But there was still a fair amount of room to improve if we wanted to be, a world leader in open and effective budgeting, which I think Toronto can be because of some of the reasons that Peter mentioned about the innovative activity that happens around our civic democracy, and also the increased interest in this level of government, one of the positive side effects of the last few years. So on participation, there have been more town halls over the years in more parts of the city, which has been an important effort. We've been pushing over time for consultation earlier in the process so that it can help to shape budgetary decisions even at the departmental level before the staff proposed budget comes out. Using interactive online tools, there are lots of emerging civic technology companies whose experience and products could be leveraged to help with that kind of consultation. There is a city council motion to comprehensively review the budget process that Councillor Layton introduced a couple of years ago, so there's work, I think, to be done to continue to rethink that. And obviously the PB project is a key part and deserves recognition for something the city's experimenting with. If you think about accessibility, which is the second principle, it's really a combination of openness, but also, not just more information, but information that people can actually understand and different kinds of people can understand. The budget documents we felt had really improved over the last few years, and city staff had made a big effort to make those documents more accessible and more visual. We still continue to push for a single budget document in the same way that the province has a single budget document. Places like the city of Chicago use that kind of a document. And continuing to release more budget data through the open data portal, which the city has started to do. In terms of vision, the idea of having a longer-term vision and tying the budget to a longer-term vision, tying it to the city's strategic plan, looking at the kinds of things that, say, the city of Calgary has done in terms of engaging its citizens in Calgary was a 100-year vision, which is quite ambitious, but thinking a little bit longer term, and then trying to tie the city's budget and resource allocation to that longer-term vision over time, we think is a really important initiative. And then the use of evidence, which is a challenge for budget makers everywhere and policymakers everywhere, but looking at tools like benefit cost analysis and value for money analysis and models such as what the Washington State Institute for Public Policy is doing on the west coast of the U.S., or what, say, the Pew and MacArthur Results First initiative is trying to spread across cities and municipalities in the U.S. So there are some very useful tools there. So that's on the City of Toronto. Just to say a few words about the PB pilot. First of all, I think it's very exciting the city is trying it. And it's been many years of work by champions like Councillor Carroll to get it on the agenda. So I think that's a very, very positive thing. Other strengths, the pilot approach, I think, makes a lot of sense to try it, to see what works and adjust as you go. And tied to that is building an evaluation, which is something the city is doing. So you can go on the city website and you can see actually the evaluation of the first year, both from the city manager's office perspective and also an outside polling firm that was brought in to look at the results. Making all that transparent, very, very positive. Dedicated resources to coordinate, located in the city manager's office, both the location of the resources, having Meg Shields and her team working on it is really important, and also having that consistent approach across the city, I think makes a lot of sense. And then finally, trying to learn from others. You can see from the city documents that they've taken a close look at what other cities have done and are trying to incorporate that. So no need to totally reinvent the wheel. So those are all positives. Some opportunities to improve. I would say, the amount of money that's been allocated in the first year was a little less than $500,000, which is something like 1 over 32,000 of the total city budget. It's relatively small. I think there is an issue of, is it enough money to get people to the table? And maybe we can talk a little bit about that in the discussion afterwards. The levels of participation, I think, is something that everyone agrees we could try to boost up. I think the average was something about 20 people per meeting who showed up. So looking at examples, trying to learn more from what New York and others have done on that score. I do wonder about if there are more opportunities to partner with community groups that themselves have civic engagement objectives and are trying to train leaders in their community, and how could you try to align this PB opportunity really as a community engagement and leadership building tool with them. I really think this is an opportunity that should be open to any councillor that wants to try it. Like, I think if there's a councillor that is keen on this and is willing to do the work with his or her staff, that the resources should be made available. And I know that's a kind of theoretical statement to make. It's harder to find the money in practice. But I do think, as someone who campaigned on PB, it would be a shame if there were potential champions that weren't given that opportunity. So I think that's another opportunity to improve. And it would be great to have Mayor Tory also embrace this as part of a broader agenda for democratizing and improving budgeting in the city. So in conclusion, I would say budgets are an underappreciated part of democracy, and it has benefits across civil society and the economy. The City of Toronto has made a lot of progress, but still has room to grow when it comes to being a world leader in open, democratic, and effective budgeting. And then finally, the participatory budgeting pilot is a very exciting first step, but also I think we could be a little less Canadian in our approach and perhaps more ambitious in how we try to scale it up. So thank you very much.
All right, so I've got a whole head full of questions that I would like to ask, but I'm just going to ask a handful, in fact, and then I'm going to open the floor because we are still going to conclude by 6 p.m. So you should be thinking about something that you might like to ask of our panel. And, Josh, I want to start by just asking about the broader international context. mentioned, of course, Porto Alegre in the video of 1989, and the experience of participatory budgeting there was in no small way a response to the failure of local and state government and an attempt to engender greater responsiveness and accountability. And as I understand, it's used in a much more ambitious way at a much greater scale. So play out for us a little bit about that account of the use of these tools and some of the lessons that have been learned in Latin America.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't talk about this too much, but so PB emerged in Latin America as a post-dictatorship effort to bring real democracy to the country. So after the country had been through decades of dictatorship, there were a lot of activists at the local level who wanted to use new openings, including legal openings. Cities have more power to empower people and to also to in particular, to make spending more equitable. And this is really the main focus from the beginning, was to have PB be what they call a pro-poor policy. So recognizing that for decades, Brazil had become one of the most unequal societies in the world, and to be very intentional about making this primarily for people who had been marginalized, who were living in the favelas and shantytowns, and to design it for those communities, and to have the process result in what they called a kind of inversion of funding. So rather than what had been happening, directing funding mainly to very high-income neighborhoods, which were beautiful, look much like Toronto, to take those funds and direct them towards shantytowns. And that approach, I think, has led more than anything to the global spread, the impacts of that. So we saw that in the first 8 years, the number of students in schools doubled. Sewage and sanitation was extended to nearly 100% of communities before they had been lacking basic sewer systems, paved roads. Public transportation was extended to low-income neighborhoods where it hadn't been before. A lot of very transient problems that, especially in the developing world, have persisted for decades. PB was able to solve by changing not policies, but the policy-making process. So changing who is at the table and who gets to decide. So it's one person, one vote, rather than just how much influence you have dictating what gets done in your community. And to wrap up on that, I think the model that was developed in Latin America, this was very much about equity. It was about social inclusion. This has been translated in different ways across the world. And I think what we've seen is the biggest impacts occur when there is a very intentional approach to engage communities who are marginalized and to have this be an inclusive process, not just a free-for-all, whoever comes gets to decide.
So I want to follow up then with Shelley, because I think it's the case that, while we're a very prosperous society here, we all still live in David Holchansky's Toronto too, and we see the kind of shearing forces in the social fabric. So to what extent for you is participatory budgeting a pro-poor, as you've just said, approach to addressing some of these inequities?
Well, so we have a slightly different problem in the city of Toronto, in my view, but I'm sure people will think about this and realize they've experienced it umpteen times. If you are having an evening where ultimately what you're really talking about is any kind of social development funding, any kind of cause or issue in the city that's going to lead to expenditures that help us with the social safety net, a certain group will come. The lower income residents certainly will come because they have the most to gain or lose in that discussion, and the agencies that serve them. If I'm talking about what flowers to plant in a traffic island in the middle of the boulevard that runs through the middle of the ward, an entirely different group of residents will come. And rarely are they all in the same room together. That's what has to happen in the city of Toronto, anywhere in this city. That's what has to happen. Because what I learned, I watched it happen in Brad Lander's ward, which is an area in Brooklyn that's certainly very gentrified, but it also has all these pockets of great renewal over a short period of time. And putting all those people in the same room led to someone coming because he wanted this flower bed on such and such a boulevard, but he had to put his project on a ballot with a community group that had a school where there were no doors on any of the washrooms in the girls' bathroom for grades K through 3. And he said, you know what, I'm going to put my flower bed on the ballot next year. I'm planning on voting for that. That conversation could be happening in Toronto far more often because we're all better than we think, than we really think we are as a community. That decision would happen in Toronto, you know. We're all terrific people. We just don't create the opportunity for that to happen often enough.
So then as a quick follow-up question, if bridging economic interests in the cities is one of the dividends paid by a process like this, what are some of the
Which
other...
is slightly different from doing it at TCHC. When
Right.
you do it in the ward and say it's $250,000 and we're all going to spend it, everyone comes to the table, some because they don't want you to waste the money, and some because I desperately need something. But they actually end up having a wonderful, very accountable conversation that they rarely have.
So with the pilot that's underway then, there's an evaluation process. What are the measures of success that you're going to be looking for over these 3 years?
Well, that's why I'm so excited that it is 3 years. First of all, if it's capacity building, it should also be building in numbers each year, because each person who experiences it becomes an ambassador. So each year the process should grow. If it doesn't, we're doing something wrong. It should also create that dialogue such that we see it popping up in conversations other than budget. I should be able to call a meeting because there's a policy issue coming up and see that greater mix in the room. Yeah.
Alex, obviously through the terrific work of Better Budgeting Toronto, you've put the emphasis on fiscal literacy and numeracy. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how participatory budgeting can be used as a vehicle to increase people's fiscal literacy and their knowledge of, see, it's not just how the money gets spent, it's actually understanding proportions, right? And understanding the scale. And I think one of the things that many people are so surprised at is the cost of a park bench or cost of all of these public goods. So how can we use these tools to increase people's kind of rules of thumb even for understanding the numbers behind our budgets?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what makes it effective is, and Josh mentioned it earlier, there are these kinds of budget tools, right? So you can go online and sort of make your own provincial or federal budget. And that's interesting, but it's very hard to relate to. And I think one of the powerful things about PB is it's relatable. You know, it's stuff in people's neighborhood. People can get their head around the dollar amounts as well, whereas, you know, the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars are very, very difficult from that perspective. And it's even sort of basic concepts that people actually do understand once they think carefully about it, but may not be their kind of gut reaction to a policy debate. Which is, you know, you got to make trade-offs, which is my neighbor's needs may be greater than my needs, which is, you know, this ward is actually quite diverse and it's got a lot of different perspectives. Most people, sort of one of the privileges of being in public life, I think, is you get to interact with a ton of different kinds of people. And most people don't live that experience every day. So even giving people, it's not really a budgeting thing in a way, but it's a form of civic and fiscal literacy that gives you a sense of what those decisions are like and gets you involved in the decisions at a scale that you can hold.
All right. I've got one last question for Josh, and then I'm going to turn to the room here. Josh, I think we could all see the smile on your face. Your eyes really lit up with your last slide as you were talking about equity, and you were talking about the kind of transformative power of this work, even when it's at the individual level, much less when it starts shifting the culture of some of these governments and institutions that have been hosts. When you think forward 20 years, if everything went really well for you, right, and went well for the project, what's the bigger promise here? What's your vision?
Great question. And I will say that it's changed a lot over the past couple of years, because originally I would have said to get to the point that we're at, and now we're here. So I have to think a bit more ambitiously now, which is a great challenge to have. I mean, I've been very excited by some of our work recently with the White House and the federal government in the States, and I think some opportunities here as well of taking this to scale so that across the country, people are deciding to spend millions of dollars on issues that affect their lives on a regular basis. and this becomes the new norm for how public budgets are spent. So not 100% of the budget, but the part of the budget that's actually in play in a given year. I think this should be how those resources are spent. And we've seen there's around 30 years of a track record. It's not at the pilot stage anymore internationally. And the question is, are we willing to really invest in this and to take it to scale? And so it's been great seeing the White House step up and say, this is a good model to allocate resources and identifying federal funds that can be allocated through participatory budgeting.
Are there any limits? Is there any part of a municipal or state budget that you wouldn't put through a process like this?
Yeah, so the majority, actually, the majority of any budget is set at the beginning of the year. And so the question is not, do we renegotiate all of our labor contracts and do we reconsider every fixed expense? It's the money that is in play in that given year. How should that be spent? And there are also differences. Some funds require more technical expertise. So we're talking about hospitals, for example. There actually are some hospital funds that I think could benefit from community engagement, and others that really depend on technical expertise. And so figuring out what are those areas where local knowledge adds to decision making, where people can bring in their experiences, and that can make decisions better. Where if you combine what people know on the ground in their neighborhood with what technical experts have been working for years on an issue, that together you can decide better.
Nicely put. All right, I've got a colleague over here with a microphone, and she's going to come to you. Now, I'd like you, just as a courtesy, to tell us who you are, and be mindful that we are looking for questions. And these are things that aren't statements where you simply raise your voice at the end to infer a question mark. That's a statement, and we'll have a chance to chat and mingle afterwards. But I'm looking for sharp, quick, penetrating questions directed at any member of the panel. All right, over to you. Show us how it's done.
I'll do my best. My name is James Potavin. I'm actually with the Global Cities Institute, one of the organizations sponsoring tonight's event. I have a question for both Josh and Shelley, I think. I think everyone in the room is incredibly impressed with the ideas that are presented here, and to know that they're going on in our city is fantastic. My question is more around the role of city councils in this. I guess I've been trying to wrap my head around what is the democratic process that this goes through? Is this something that's debated in council? I'm just kind of interested on the actual political process behind it, because it's such a wonderful idea. I'm just interested in the mechanics of it a little bit more, and I thought perhaps you two would be the most equipped to speak to that. Anyway, thank you very much.
Shelley, quickly, do you want to start?
Well, I touched on it a little bit in my presentation. It was tough for us to create the envelope for this because, as I've said, it's easier in the U.S. strong mayor cities model. We have a new city manager who's saying we need a new funding model, and you guys have to have an icky conversation. So council has a bigger role to play. But what we did to make sure that this would meet the rules sort of demonstrated for us in Chicago and New York is we're using monies that go every year into a reserve fund for things like parks, public realm and such, and are sitting there so that council only has to decide to have a PB. We'll never have that mistake again where community members decide what's going on the ballot through their brainstorming and ballot selection, then vote, and then council amends it. It's out of our hands. Once the vote is taken, out of that reserve envelope that has been sitting there waiting for those votes, those projects are simply added at a zero net entry into the capital budget of the following year. So this year, we're really demonstrating the most important, the part 4 in your equation there. The projects voted on last spring will be implemented in this year's capital season. And council has no part in that. They don't need to. They're embedded in the budget through a reserve fund in holding from last year. The funds for this year's $250,000 decision are now sitting in the account waiting for next year. Ultimately, though, it should be a part of Peter Wallace's discussion about a new funding model because what happened in Vallejo is they said we're introducing a sales tax, for instance, or whatever new stream of revenue you might put aside. You might want to take the base predictable amount and say, let's make sure this portion of that is dedicated to PB and really begin to build the capacity just of the wards and the councilors and the capital execution staff to use it in that way.
Imagine 1% for participation. Josh, what can you add?
Yeah, I'll speak a bit more broadly and also from experience. And we've been working with several cities where there have been both council member or councilor-based processes and also where there have been citywide processes coordinated by the mayor's office or administration. So it's had a lot of good lessons in the pros and cons of different approaches. What we've seen most successful is if councilors can play a role of supporting the process, so helping to bring people in, to help staff some of the events, to be present, to build relationships. So using it as a way to have stronger relationships between their office and the community. These are often great spaces of yes as opposed to no, as Shelley has said. And to share power, which isn't intuitive. And when talking with officials, often the responses we get, some of them are totally bought into this. Some of them say, I was elected to decide, and this is abdicating my power. We've seen this most successful when the approach is, this is a way for me to fulfill my mission by building community and by empowering my community. I was not elected to decide, I was elected to make my community better. And this is a proven way to make my community better, and therefore that is the role I should play. But that requires a bit of a shift, a fairly deep theoretical shift, in fact, of the role of elected officials. That it's not we elect them to decide, we elect them to make our community better, and there are better ways to do that than just leaving it all to them. And that really hasn't been working out too well, actually.
Nicely expressed. All right, I see a couple of hands here, quite many hands. All right, but we're going to take two questions at the same time, hand it back to the panel. All right, first.
Okay, my question is for Josh Lerner. I'm sorry, my name is Eduardo Fernandez. I am teaching here in U of T. And I am also a former managing director of the Latin American Development Bank. My question to Josh Lerner is, how has been the experience different than the one in Brazil, in Latin America, for example, in Argentina and the other countries, and what has been the lesson learned? Because Latin American movement, political and budgeting process is different.
I'm going to give you just a few seconds to build on your earlier response. There's a woman at the back corner there on the bench. Yes, I think you had a question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Erica. I'm from the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity. My question has to do with accountability. So under the PB model, who's accountable? Elected officials or the people?
Excellent. I'm going to take one more because that was so succinct and well expressed, and then we'll give each panelist a chance to respond.
Thank you. My name is Gregory Chupka. I'm a resident of Hamilton. My understanding is that the province of Ontario has said that they want to invest in rapid transit, take $1.1 billion, take it or leave it. And that just struck me the wrong way. I'm wondering if this process, which I think is lovely, could be expanded into that level of really changing a city or building the future.
All right, there we go. So Josh, Latin America. Alex, you're going to tell us about accountability. We're going to end on rapid transit and broader application.
Oh, gee, thanks.
I know.
No, I'm fine.
Josh.
Sure. Yeah, so differences with Latin America, a few key ones that I'll highlight. The roles of political parties and community organizations are very different in Latin America compared to the US and Canada. So political parties are much weaker here than the most Latin American countries, and a lot of PB processes in Latin America have been much more driven by political parties, for better and worse. And one of the benefits, I think, of some of the work, especially in the US and in some places in Canada, has been a really strong role of community organizations and having this be more of a co-governance process. Which means that it has deeper roots in the community. So even if a party is kicked out of power, it's not seen as strictly an instrument of that political party, that it's something that is more owned by the community. And so building up that community infrastructure has been very powerful. The other thing I would highlight is the needs are very different, obviously. So in Brazil, they started out paving roads. The roads here are more or less paved. But there are other issues which often aren't as visible. And so how do you address the needs of immigrant communities that are living in what look like nice suburban neighborhoods, but under very challenging conditions? And how do you make sure that funding goes to those projects that aren't as literally concrete? in many ways. And so that's, I think, one of the bigger challenges that we're still dealing with here is figuring out how to direct resources towards less visible but very urgent needs.
Kelly, transit, broader applicability for some of these regional and very costly issues?
Yes, one of the things that you face when you start into the bigger infrastructure pieces is the Environmental Assessment Act. There are very prescriptive rules about how you do it. But Peter asked Josh about, what about 20 years from now? How does this look 20 years from now? If this became an expectation embedded in everyone's mind, then think about the difference in the choices. In an environmental assessment, staff go away, they do their work, and they put 3 options on foam core boards and stick them in a room, and you have a menu of 3 options. In PB, you pick the options. You decide first what we're going to choose from. And you're given all of the same tools staff do to do that. They tell you these are the constraints, these are some reasons why you might not be able to do that or that. But let's decide on the menu together. Then we'll go away and we'll work on it, and we'll come back and we'll tell you, well, that one is a problem, this one is a problem. That's the way you do the decision-making in PB. So if you think about it, if that expectation begins to build in the mind of people, I don't think we're very far from the point when people are now going back to other governments and saying, there's a great big piece missing at the front end of EA. And that's where we should actually have some say. That's a lot of what Alex is trying to get at and saying, after we adopt the budget, why aren't we having the consultation on next year's budget next week? Yeah.
I think that's such an important point of the entire process is the framing piece up front, not just choosing from amongst a menu of given options. And that's largely what we have when it comes to consultation, insofar that it occurs. So bring this all together for us. Think about the accountability, right? And I like this part too, because Josh said, you know, making a community better versus deciding. It's a different kind of ethos. It's a different way of understanding the role of a representative. So play it out for us in terms of how a representative could understand their accountability when it comes to interacting with these processes.
Well, I'll try to answer the accountability question, which I think is a really good one, relatively narrowly, which is just to say, here's how I guess I would have thought about it, you know, as a candidate. Wasn't ultimately successful, but I think the elected person who decides to bring it in is accountable for the process and making sure it runs well. And if it runs badly and community members aren't happy with the process or feel like they've wasted their time, then that's on them. And to some degree, it's on other city government folks who participate in that process. In terms of the outcome, I think that's something the community is accountable for, in the same way that the community is accountable for the outcome of an election, and that's part of what builds a sense of community. You know, I think sometimes this debate comes down to in some ways a kind of theoretical debate about representative democracy versus other models of democracy. I mean, the fact is, elected people make decisions. They make decisions based on information. They want the best information they can get, and part of the information that's relevant is what do people actually want and what do they need. And one of the very powerful things that Councillor Joe Moore said at a session that Josh hosted and Shelley spoke at a couple of years ago was, this helps me. I actually feel like I make better decisions because I can drive around my ward and I can make assessments of this road's in better shape than that road, but people who actually live on the street and are in their kids' school or playground every day, they actually are more expert on this stuff than I am. And I thought that was a very honest assessment by an elected person, and is probably more widely held view than some people in the public might think in terms of the quote unquote deciders. So I think it's when we think about representative democracy, part of it is it's not really about the polar ends of that spectrum, right? A referendum on everything versus the decider. It's how do we get good information in the hands to make those resource allocation decisions.
The neighbors did become accountable to each other, though, which I found interesting. Meg will remember this. We had I can't remember if you were at that session. I don't attend them all, by the way, so that I can't be accused by my colleagues of using it for political points. I make a point of arranging the schedule so Councillor Carroll's not here tonight to rescue you. Brainstorm away. She's not going to say a word because she's not even here. But at one of those sessions, somebody was talking about cycling infrastructure, which is, we were We were jazzed to be hearing that at Don Mills and Shepherd. But the person who did it, busy person, didn't have time. He thought there should be bike lockers at Don Mills subway station, but he couldn't champion it. He wasn't going to be able to come to every meeting. At the next meeting, a man, Ian must be 70, he hasn't been on a bike in 30 years, said, well, somebody should really champion those bike lockers, I'll take it. They won with the champion who hasn't owned a bike for 30 years, but he felt accountable to his neighbors. Somebody put that on the table and someone's got to pick it up, and I've got time. Bam, up went his hand.
Terrific. Visionary, practical, heartening. This has been a great discussion. Enid.
My job is to thank people. What a fantastic discussion. I think we could have gone on for much longer. You know, the takeaway for me today is that participatory budgeting is about a lot more than deciding how a small part of the budget is going to be allocated. It's about engaging people on city issues. It's about better communication between governments and people. It's about allowing people who can't vote in elections to actually be able to vote on what is happening in their city. It's about engaging youth, and I could go on and on and on. And I think Shelley said something that really struck with me. It's a different way of talking about issues. It's a different conversation, much less confrontational. But I can't help but think, as I was looking through Shelley's slides, if you want to improve participation, perhaps that participatory budgeting pilot cake should be part of the mix, you know?
Be every meeting. Cake every meeting.
Cake every meeting.
Duly noted.
You'll have a great turnout. So I would like to thank Peter for stepping in as moderator for us at the last minute. Sure didn't look like the last minute the way you did it. Josh for coming from New York and for being a success. You know, I can say he was a student of mine. Shelley, for your passion about the issue. And Alex, anytime you want to say good things about IMFG, you can always come back here and be on a panel. I would also... I would also like to thank all of our partners who co-sponsored Big City, Big Ideas today. This event ran smoothly, and it did run smoothly, because of a number of people who helped put it together. Carolyn Carteropol, Abigail Friendly, and Selena Zhang from IMFG. The tech staff here, who I could see running around making everything work. I'd also like to thank Mary Castell and Christy Yuen at Urban Strategies, who design all of these promotional materials for us. And thank you, the audience, for coming today and participating in this discussion. Have a good evening.